I'd like to say something about evaluative arguments, which often use implied reasoning or missing premises. Nearly all evaluative arguments contain prescriptions. We should do this, we shouldn't do that. Evaluative arguments have conclusions that claim that something has a certain value, good or bad, right or wrong, beautiful or ugly, and so forth. They may also be arguments for the conclusion that something is permissible, that is, may be done, obligatory, ought to be done, or forbidden, should not be done. Here's an evaluative argument with a missing premise. See if you can figure out what it is. Premise, you cheated on the test. Conclusion, therefore, you shouldn't pass the test. The missing evaluative premise is expressed as a conditional statement, that is, an if-then statement. If you cheat on the exam, you should not pass. It's left unstated, so we need to actually assert it when we reconstruct the argument. But why? The principles of reconstruction, that is, faithfulness and charity, require that we include the implied reasoning, since only when all the premises are explicit can we properly evaluate the argument, in particular, the nature of the logical support provided by the premises. In this argument, the conclusion is a normative or prescriptive statement, a statement about whether something ought to be true relative to some standard of evaluation. Normative statements can be contrasted with descriptive statements, which are simply factual claims about what is true. For example, the federal government has not legalized marijuana is a descriptive statement. That is, it is simply a claim about what is in fact the case in the United States today. In contrast, the federal government should not legalize marijuana is a normative statement, since it is not a claim about what is true, but what ought to be true relative to some standard of evaluation. For example, the federal legal statutes governing marijuana possession. This is an important area within philosophy, which is often traced back to the Scottish philosopher David Hume. Namely, that statements about what ought to be the case, that is, normative statements, can never be derived from statements about what is the case, that is, descriptive statements. This is known within philosophy as the is-ought gap. The problem is that we are attempting to infer a normative statement from a purely descriptive statement, violating the is-ought gap, as this short video demonstrates.
Can you derive what you ought to do from facts about the world? This is a style of argument many people use. They take how things are and use that to draw conclusions about how things should be. For example, we evolved as meat-eating animals. Therefore, we ought to eat meat. Is this a reasonable way of arguing? David Hume thought not. In his view, people move too readily from observations of facts to judgments about values. There's a gap in their reasoning. This is the famous is-ought gap, also known as Hume's law or Hume's guillotine, because he severs any direct connection between facts and values. In the meat-eating example, there's an implied unstated assumption. We ought to do whatever we evolved to do. But that is a controversial moral premise that vegetarians would dispute. Since Hume described it in the 18th century, numerous moralists have tried to bridge this is-ought gap. They've argued from what is natural or unnatural to what we should or shouldn't do, from facts about what makes human beings happy to evaluations of what we should do next, or from discoveries about human biology to claims about how we ought to live. If Hume was right, they've all committed a logical mistake.
The is-ought gap often involves evaluative arguments that depend on a missing, assumed, or implicit premise. That missing premise must be a normative statement in order that we can infer the conclusion, which is also a normative statement. There is an important general lesson here. Many times, an argument with a normative conclusion will depend on a normative premise which is not explicitly stated. In reconstructing the argument, the missing normative premise must always be made explicit if it is neither obvious nor controversial.